Hi, everybody. Welcome, and thank you for joining us here on this episode of the Blockcast. We're live here from the World Ethical Data Forum in Barcelona. I'm here with Ralph Merkle, who just had his 1 hour live broadcast here at the forum. Ralph, thanks so much for joining us.
It's my pleasure.
Ralph, you covered some really interesting topics during your talk, and I'd love to dig in just for our audience here as well. Could you tell them a little bit more about how you came up with the concepts around the Merkle trees, and how that's evolved since your discovery of them?
Well, basically, the Merkle trees, in some sense, that whole line of research developed because I was frustrated in how to get digital signatures cleanly from the knapsack. And as I was working on how to get digital signatures, I realized you could use hash functions to get digital signatures. And in the process of developing digital signatures from hash functions, I was forced to develop the Merkle trees because that's how you make a digital signature based purely on hash functions compact. And once I had developed it, I realized, hey, these things are useful for a lot of other stuff. So at that time, I said, I should go ahead and patent this.
Interesting.
And I went into the patent office and said, hey, we should patent this. This is a wonderful idea. And actually, what's amusing is that the claims for the Merkle tree, you might notice that the claims in the patent are few in number. That's because I wrote them.
Oh, wow. That's
And not being the usual legal type, I did not,
right.
write a long list of exhaustive claims that
Claims, right.
covered everything under the sun. I just said, you want me to write the claims? Okay. So with a little consultation with the lawyers, I just blasted out some claims.
Interesting. Have there been a lot of, maybe you haven't followed this, but have there been a lot of patents, that have kind of cited your original patent that you
Yeah,
know?
well, basically, there were a couple of companies that used the Merkle trees as the basis for some of the things they did later on, because Merkle trees are pretty foundational. I mean, once you realize that you can use this as a hammer, and it's a very powerful hammer, then yeah, other people say, oh, we could use this for other things as well.
Yeah, absolutely. And during your talk, you mentioned something around, with the advent of Bitcoin. I mean, how does that play into your original thesis on Merkle trees? Is it just that Bitcoin includes the the cryptocurrency piece, which enables kind of that benefit to key stakeholders?
Yeah, well, basically, Merkle trees were one of the components that went into Bitcoin. So there are a couple of ideas that played into Bitcoin, and the hash functions and the Merkle trees were one of them.
Okay.
Merkle trees were sort of one of the critical enablers. And, I wish I'd, you know, been more aware at the time, but
Right.
hey,
And
it is what it is.
and when did you first hear about Bitcoin? I mean, was it recently? We're now in
It
2018.
was several. No, it was years after Bitcoin became popular, and I went back and took a look at it and said, "Oh wow, that's nifty." I
And
mean, it really is a clean solution.
yeah,
I mean,
definitely.
forget the cryptocurrency angle of it. It's a very nice way of dealing with the how do you, from my perspective at least, it's a very nice way of, oh, how do you update an authentication tree? How do you get a new authentication tree that's updated and has, new information in it?
Right.
Uh,
Yeah. It's an interesting way of how they keep the ledger alive, and distributed in that sense. I mean, do you see things like Bitcoin? Again, I don't know the differences just between like proof of stake and proof of work. Do you have any thoughts on that in terms of the
well,
hashing
that's
functions?
interesting. I mean, intuitively, you would think that burning huge amounts of computer time for what appears to be no particular purpose would not be inherently necessary.
Right.
So the thought would be that something other than that should be feasible. And then, once you have that intuition, then of course the problem is cooking up a system that does it in a clean and wonderful way. But I mean, the original Bitcoin system is remarkable for its simplicity and its effectiveness.
Right.
So anyone who wants to cook up a competitor has got to cook up something that is, I don't know if it has to be equally simple and equally clean, but has to be as compelling,
Right.
In terms of the arguments for it. Now, actually, if you start throwing prediction markets into your system, I don't know if it's as compelling, but it is a way of doing the security. If you've got a built-in prediction market, you can start to do things like saying, well, my prediction market can be used to predict security issues. So if there is a risk of compromise of the system, you would think a prediction market could sniff that out. So you do things like, say, have the prediction market engaged in predicting what components in the system might be compromised. So once you have a functioning system with a prediction market built into it, which is a more complex system, then you could use that prediction market to say this component of the system might be compromised. Or if you have a set of servers, you might use the prediction market to predict which of those servers would be most reliable. And then you could say, let's replace this proof of work with a prediction market that would say these servers are least likely to be compromised.
Okay.
And those servers are more at risk, and now you're funding the prediction market. Now, that still involves subsidy. In other words, to get a prediction market to work effectively, you have to subsidize it.
Right.
So there's still a parameter of how much do you want to subsidize the prediction market. It's sort of like funding an intelligence agency to go out and sniff around and find out what's going on.
Right.
But it's a different kind of subsidy, and hopefully it would require less money to put effort into that. So, but that's an interesting alternative, and I don't know what the exact financial trade-off would be.
Right.
Hopefully it would be more effective. But, investigating that as an alternative would require, I think, implementing such a system and seeing what happened. So that's going to be a relatively complex question to investigate.
Sure, yeah, absolutely. And all the very interesting stuff in how the technologies are developing. Especially a lot of these technologies are open source, so you got some of the brightest minds working around these technologies all the time. Do you have a specific stance on, smart contract development? I know there's Ethereum, the Hyperledger. There's a lot of questions around, are smart contracts the future? Are they the future of real estate or the future of banking, of deal making? Currently, they're all for, they've just been used for ICOs, which, there's quite a bad rap in the industry right now. But do you have any specific thoughts on smart contracts, and do they pose a major technological advancement in your opinion?
Well, generally, I think all of these ideas of having intelligence in the system seem like good ideas. So generically, I would have to be in favor of them. That said, obviously, you run the risk on any of these new systems that they have bugs.
Right.
So I would always, urge caution on these systems as they initially come out. But overall, I would have to be very supportive. Systems like this look like they should be very valuable. They should look like they should make major contributions. And once we've come to understand them and learn, how to best use them, I think they will make a major contribution. So, with the usual cautions that new systems,
Sure,
we have to understand them. I think they're great.
Yeah, you brought up a lot of interesting, your topic around DAO democracies. Very, very interesting. I'm very interested in kind of the decentralized autonomous organizations myself, and how they can kind of further, both in a business sense and a governmental sense, that decision-making process. But I don't know. I don't know if you heard, the first DAO that ever launched was on Ethereum. So it's interesting that you say that. But I remember they raised around 200 million, and there was a bug in the code which actually
Yeah,
ended up forking Ethereum. There's Ethereum and Ethereum Classic now because of it.
yeah,
And just that one bug in the smart contract, it's immutable, so you can't go back and change
one
it. And
bug.
yeah,
Yeah,
one
no, yeah, I think that's one of the things about these things is you have to be very careful.
right,
And a single bug. I mean, Bitcoin. Okay, Bitcoin. The ability. How do I put it? Governance in the whole Bitcoin process is an interesting question. I mean, obviously, Bitcoin. The thought originally was that Bitcoin didn't need governance, and obviously that's untrue.
right,
And I think the evolution of governance in the framework of these DAOs is a concept that people are beginning to understand, and there are a number of issues floating around. And I think people are beginning to grapple with that, and understand it, or have grappled with it, and are beginning to understand it. So we're still early in the stages of it. But
right,
the bottom line is digitally authenticated information that can be updated is clearly valuable.
right,
And this whole set of concepts allows you to place much greater faith and have much greater reliability in the digital information that's being produced. Now, do we fully understand all of the ins and outs and all the wrinkles? That's hard to say. I mean, in cryptography, you learn to be pretty circumspect
right,
because cryptographic systems, I mean, historically, we've had systems that looked pretty good and then were broken.
right,
So, and we've had protocols that looked pretty good and then were broken.
right,
So, learn to be fairly circumspect. At the same time, however, these systems are bringing great value.
right,
And as we shake them down further and as we shake out the bugs, the value they can bring increases. And as our confidence in them grows, the value they can bring increases. So I think, the message is, hey, check them out, make sure the bugs have been flushed out of the system. And then once we're pretty confident they can bear the weight that we put on them, move forward.
right. Yeah, absolutely. Definitely audit the code and make sure everything's
Yeah.
properly tested, QA'd. Um,
Yeah.
Quick question for you as well. I mean, with the advent of quantum computing, and I don't know how far off that is, but does that in a
I
way
think someone else.
does that in a way is that going to affect traditional encryption technologies? I mean, once quantum
um,
computing comes out, could that break a lot of the encryption technologies that are used today? And how can encryption continue to grow to keep up with the pace of computational power increasing at an exponential rate?
well, I'll qualify my answer by saying I haven't been fully keeping up with all the latest in the quantum world, which is pretty weird. But my understanding is that conventional block ciphers will suffer from a square root attack, which is one of the reasons AES has a 256-bit key size
Right,
rather than 128-bit key size, is specifically to counter attack by a quantum computer.
right.
So that looks like it's adequate. It looks like block ciphers are fine. And it looks like the hash functions will be fine. You increase the size a little bit and you're
And you're
okay.
okay. Right. Got it.
Uh, on the other hand, the widely used public key systems get flushed down the toilet.
Right.
And that's the kind of break where you start to get uncomfortable.
Right.
And that's the kind of break where a lot of folks, including me, are saying, it'd be a good idea to start transitioning to a quantum resistant system.
Right. Absolutely. That's very interesting. And just one more note, kind of looking at at the future. Just love your thoughts on this. You mentioned the singularity in your presentation, and I know there's a lot of talk about it in the upper echelons of science. Ray Kurzweil at Google talks about the singularity hitting in, I believe, in 2030. He's convinced. That seems so soon to me. specifically, but I mean, we didn't have iPhones, what, 10, 12 years ago. Elon Musk compares it to, opening up a genie bottle with a demon inside and not knowing what's going to come out. What's your sentiment there? Is sentient
Um,
AI on the way? Is the singularity, is it a potential doomsday scenario there? Or is it something that with human assistance will be able to be maintained and controlled?
well, the singularity is coming. We are going to have a transition to very powerful computers, and those computers will have an intelligence that is greater than human. I think that Ray is saying that human level intelligence is coming in 2030. The
Okay.
full blown singularity comes a little bit after that, maybe another decade or something. But if you want to get a good idea of the timelines, I think Ray is the best positioned person to talk about that. Ray has this very eccentric concept that you should actually gather data on the rate of progress and plot it on semi-log paper. And his penchant for gathering actual data and plotting on a semi-log paper and then extrapolating from that data has gotten him in a lot of trouble. Most people who talk about the future, how does one phrase it delicately, have a tendency of just blathering and don't bother gathering data,
Right.
uh, which is probably not helpful. Ray's use of data is, I think, refreshing and actually gives him, I think, more credibility than people who don't use data.
Sure.
And when you look at the development of or the extrapolations that he's talking about, you really have to take them pretty seriously. There are cases where the extrapolations just stop. The most famous example of that is the clock speed of computers. You have probably noticed that the clock speed of commercial computers, you go to the store and you buy a computer, it's 3 gigahertz,
Right.
more or less, give or take a bit.
Sure.
And it has been 3 gigahertz for a decade or more.
Right.
And the reason for that is heat. If you run it at a higher clock speed, and you could run it at a higher clock speed, it's just the computer would get hot and melt.
Interesting.
So that was on an exponential trend. And if you
Yeah.
look at the plots, the clock speed was going up on an exponential trend, and then it just hit a wall
Right.
and stopped.
Yeah.
So that's an example where, yes, we did have an exponential trend, and then it hit a wall and stopped.
Right.
But if you look at the other trends in terms of miniaturization and increasing power, those have not hit a wall yet. I think a lot of people are predicting the end of Moore's law. I'm not. I am predicting a transition in technology. So, for example, if you look at integrated circuits are getting pushed pretty hard. And if you think about integrated circuits, and if you think integrated circuits are the final technology, then you start making statements like, well, Moore's law is coming to an end. But if you view integrated circuits as simply a technology in a progression of technologies from relays to vacuum tubes to transistors to integrated circuits, then, okay, if integrated circuits run out of steam, that's okay. Then we shift on to the next technology.
Right.
And we'll keep going on our merry way, because integrated circuits have not hit any fundamental limits that are driven by the laws of physics. They might be hitting limits that are driven by that particular manufacturing process.
Very interesting.
Yeah.
Yeah, it's interesting how, I mean, I always thought, yeah, 3 gigahertz, we hit that, and then it's just, I remember when I was just a young kid, we were at like 233 megahertz, and I got the 400 megahertz system, and I was just this
Yeah.
thing. Yeah, but after the 2.5, I mean, they're all quite the same. It's just about adding RAM and cores at this point.
Yep.
Perfect. Well, Ralph, thank you so much for joining us on this episode of the Blockcast. Really appreciate you joining us here at the World Ethical Data Forum. And all your insights and thoughts, and look forward to seeing you here again next year.
Sounds good.
Thank you.